SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to this lecture on biomathematics. In the last lecture, we started discussing statistics, how statistics can be applied in biology, and we took a simple example of a few examples like traveling to your college and number of students, mark for an exam and all that, and we discussed the idea of average and standard deviation. Now, so the basic question we had is that we get a lot of data in from experiments, large amount of data, and given this huge data set or set of numbers. Data is essentially a set of numbers. How do we make sense out of these numbers? What we can learn from these numbers? And we learned that average and standard deviation is some two simple things that we can learn, and that has a meaning, and there are two numbers. From a huge data set, we can extract two numbers, meaningful numbers, average and standard deviation. What more can we do this? That is what we are going to discuss in this lecture. What more we can extract from the data, or how do we present the data so that we have much more information, we can convey much more meaningful information. Okay, so today again we have statistics as our main title. In statistics, we will have, so this is the slide in statistics we will discuss in specifically probability distribution. So we will go ahead and see what do we mean by probability distribution. So as we said, we had various experiments. So one of the experiment was traveling to the college, but we will discuss a new experiment, a simple experiment that you all can do yourself. We don't need a big setup or anything, just you can do it in your class. So let us do a simple experiment of measuring height. So the experiment is measure height. So measure height of boys in your class. So this is a simple experiment that anybody can do. You can measure the height of all boys, let's say, or girls. So here we take example of boys because some numbers that we use might be more suitable here for this example. So if we do this experiment, let us say you just go on and measure now all the heights of each and every student in your class, and what do we get when we measure? We will be getting a big data set. So let's look at something what you will typically get. You will typically get a set of numbers. So let's see, here is what let's say in your class, if you just look at the numbers, so you can have 150 centimeter, 171 centimeter, 165 centimeter, 140 centimeter. So some numbers, these are some kind of reasonable numbers. You know that so the many of them around 150, 140, very few 180. This is just 180. There is nothing bigger than 180. As you see here, there is one person 180 centimeters, and this one person with 131 centimeter, very small short person, and very tall person, and others somewhere in between. So you have large number of such data set, such numbers. So this is not ending here, this is just a continuous list. So, let us say you do this measurement, and how do we make sense of this data? So, we have this huge data here, and how do we make sense of this data? So, let us say we have hundreds, we measure heights of hundreds of students, and so we have 100 such numbers 150, 160, 130, 140, 122, 135, 100 numbers. How do we make sense of this data? So, two things we learned are that we can find the average of and standard deviation. We can say that average is 155 centimeters or 150 centimeters. That will give you some idea, and we can say standard deviation is plus or minus 20. So, standard deviation is 20. So, we can say that average is 150 and the standard deviation is 20, that means 150 plus or minus 20. So, this is something which we can say if we wish, like using the idea that we learned in the last class, in the last lecture. But the question is there any other way we can present this data so that it reveals much more useful information, more than average and standard deviation can give? Can we present this data instead of presenting all this many numbers here? Can we present this data in a different way such that this reveals much more information by just looking the way we present it? So, just writing down these numbers is a very bad idea. It's like a very stupid idea in some sense, or it's not like it's not a great idea. It doesn't make much of a sense. You see a lot of numbers. What does it mean? Like just many numbers. It doesn't make much sense. But if we present it in a particular way, is there a smart way of presenting this such that it makes much more sense? By just seeing that, you should be able to make out lot more information than either average or standard deviation, or just by one glance of these numbers, anyway doesn't make much sense. So, just more than standard deviation and average, we need much more information. And how do we present this such that, how do we present these numbers in one slide such that it reveals a lot of information? So, the answer to, so this is the question, is there any other way we can present this data so that it reveals much more useful information? And the answer is distribution. So, we will discuss what does distribution means. So, but just the meaning of the word would tell you we are talking about heights. So, we want to present the distribution of heights. So, how do we present the distribution of heights? So, let us look at this. This is one way. So, we can say that presented in different range. So, let us say we can break down the data into ranges. How many students are there having a height in the range of 130 to 140 centimeters? So, this height range is in centimeters. So, if the height range is between 130 and 140 centimeter, how many students are there? Just one student. How many students are there having height between 140 centimeter and 150 centimeters? Let us say there are 17 students. So, this is why this column is number of students having height in this range. So, 150 and 160, how many students are there such that the heights fall in between 150 centimeter and 160 centimeter? There are 35 students. There are 30 students having height in between 160 and 170, and there are 15 students having height in between 170 and 180, and there are 2 students having height in this range between 180 and 190. So, large number of students in the middle and a few students with very short few students, and very long few students. So, very tall students only 2, very short students only 1 student, like very short. Tall, 2 tall students, and all else somewhere in the middle. So, this is the typical data that you expect, and this is what you have. So, this is actually a smart way of presenting the data, because this gives you some idea. But if this is just a table, and if we plot this table in a graph, which we always like to present the data in graph, as a graph, that can make much more sense. So, one way of presenting such things are called histograms. So, when you have data, this kind of data, if you plot it, they appear as if like a histogram. So, what is a histogram? See this. So, let us say between 130 and 140, this is what I mean by 135, I just put some number in between here. There is one student with 135, height between 130 and 140. So, h is the height, and n of h is the number of students having height h. So, what is the distribution of heights? So, n of h you can call distribution. So, this is essentially the same thing that we saw, like if we can draw this in a different way if you wish. So, we can draw this h and n of h. So, how many students are there between 130 and 140? So, there is 150, there is 160, there is 170, there is 180, there is 190. So, these are the numbers we have. So, 130. So, let me write, this is 130. Okay, let me write it little more clearly, so that it's a little more clear for you. So, let me draw this little more clearly. So, you have let us say this is 130, 140, 150, 160, 170, 180, 190. So, how many students? So, in this table, if they had one student between 130 and 140. So, between 130 and 140 we have just one student. So, we mark it 1. So, between 130 just one student. Between 140 and 150 there were 17 students. So, between 140 and 150 there were 17 students. So, let us mark this as 17. So, this is 17. Between 150 and 160, how many students? So, this table tell you between 150 and 160 there are 35 students. So, between 150 and 160 there are 35 students. So, let me mark this as 35. This is 35. So, there are 35 students in this range. Between 160 and 170 there are 30 students. That is what this table says, 30 students in this range. So, 160 and 170, 30. So, this is, let us say this is 30 somewhere here, this is 30. So, somewhere here 30. So, if we can mark this way, 30 students, and 170 and 180 in this range there are 15 students. So, this is 17, so this is 15. So, 15 students in this range, between 170 and 180, 15 students, and 180 and 190 only 2 students. So, this is 1 and 2 is here. So, this is like 2 students. So, this kind of a block diagram, if you wish, so if in a block, like in a manner something like a block, like, so it's a block of 130, 140, another block of 140, 150, another block of 150, 160, So another block here, another block here, another block here. So this kind of a plot is called histogram, if you wish. So this is called histogram. So this is distribution. So this is height in a particular range, and this is number of students having that height h. So this is what essentially plotted here in this. Exactly what we just drew is plotted here. So there is between 130 and 140, I just marked by 135. There are 1, and there is this 30, 35. This is 17. This is just above 15. This is 17, 35, and this is 30. So again, this is 15, and this is 2. So this is a histogram, and we can call this distribution. But is this an accurate representation? In some sense, it is not very accurate. Why? Because there are students with 130, 132, 133, we all put in one range. So we do not actually distinguish between students having 139 height and 131 height. Height 131 centimeter and 139 centimeter, they are all in one range. Like let us look at here, if a student having 151 and 159, we put them in same range. So we can actually reduce the range if you wish. So instead of writing 130, 140, if I wish, I could write how many students between 130 and 132, 132, 134. So we can make this in 2 centimeter, and let us say 150 and 152, 160, similarly 152, 154. So like 161, 150, 160, 162, 162, 164. So like this you can write, you can take an interval of 2. So then you can make the interval smaller and smaller, then that will be a better description of the data. So essentially you can make the range smaller to get a better description of the real data. Now how small it should be, how small the range should be. Let us say that when you measure this height, you don't have, let us say this, your tape which you measure can only measure this in centimeters. You cannot measure less than a centimeter. Let us say you cannot measure millimeter, you can only measure in centimeters. Then you can present the data in the range of 1 centimeter if you wish. So then there is nothing better than that. That is the best description of the data. So then you can ask the question, how many students having height 131 centimeter? How many students having height 132 centimeter? How many students having height 134 centimeter? How many students having height 151 centimeter? So each centimeter by centimeter you can have this data presented. So let's say you have the data presented such a way that n of hi is the number of students having height hi. Height could be like 31, so the heights could be 131, 151, 162, any number. In short, you can call this. So now let us say you plot this as a distribution. So now if you plot this as a distribution, you will have many histograms. So let us say you have a histogram. So, let's say you have a histogram like this. So, I call this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So, what are this? These are ranges. You took 10 ranges. So, just like here in the previous example we had how many ranges? We had like 1 range, 2 second range, 3rd range, 4th range, 5th range, 6th range. So, we had 6 histograms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Similarly, let us say if we are presenting the data of height of students between 130 and 180 centimeter by centimeter. So, you can have so you can have 130 here, 180 here. So, how many students having 130? Maybe 1 student. How many students 131? How many students 132? So, you can have for each centimeter. So, you can have like 50 points. So, you can have 50 points like this. For each centimeter, how many students having? So, this is HI. So, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. So, H1 is 130 centimeter, H2 is 131 centimeter. Similarly, H50 is 180 centimeter. So, you can write this way. So, basically you can have HI versus N of HI graph which might have some particular shape. So, then let us say it has this particular shape N of HI versus HI. If you take for centimeter by centimeter, that means you ask the question how many students having 130 centimeter, that is this is number. So, this could go from 0 to some particular number, let us say 100. How many students having 132 centimeter? How many students having 134 centimeter? How many students having 180 centimeter? So, you can ask this question. So, you have 2 things, you have N of HI, number of students having height HI. Now, if you do this sum over I N of HI, what does this mean? If I write sum over I is equal to 1 to 50, there are 50 now different heights. What does this mean? What does this imply? So, let us think about it. So, let us expand this. When we expand this, sum over, so this is if I N of H1 plus N of H2 plus N of H3 plus dot N of H50. So, let us say H1 is 131 centimeter. So, this is number of students having 131 centimeter, number of students having height 132 centimeter, number of students having height 133 centimeter plus dot number of students having height 180 centimeter. So, this will give you total number of students. Right, because if you this involves all the students, number of having height 131 to 180, like all the we are measuring centimeter by centimeter and we are having this kind of a histogram, and then we are doing the sum, and at the end what will you get is the total number of students. So, that is what essentially shown in this slide here. Sum over I Ni, by Ni I mean N of Hi, I get something called N, which is the total number of students, and if I divide this N of H by N, I can define something called P of H. In other words, if you wish, you can write it as P of H I is equal to N of H I divided by N, where N is equal to sum over I N of H I. So, actually in the slide here it should be N of H I. So, I can write here in this particular way. So, this is the correct way to write it. So, if this is the case, what is P of H I? So, we can call the P of H I as probability. So, we will later come and understand what does this probability actually mean, but let us call this as probability. Probability is essentially some number between 0 and 1. Probability is some number between 0 and 1. If you just at this moment, it is for you to just realize what is the colloquial meaning of probability, which you all know. When you say something is very highly probable, that means very likely, that is very something not very probable, that means very unlikely. So, let us have understand only this much at this moment, and let us also understand that probability P is some number between 0 and 1. So, it can be 0 and it can be 1 or anything in between. So, probability is some number between 0 and 1, and probability that you have a height h, that is what we actually defined now. Probability that you have a height h is number of students having that height h divided by the total number of students. So, if we have one student, so let us say, now let us imagine that n is 100, let us take n is 100, then let us calculate. So, let us say there are one student with height 131 centimeter, there are 10 students with height 140 centimeter, let us say there are 15 students with height 150 centimeter, and there are 0 students with height 180 centimeter. Let us say there are 0 students with height 180 centimeter. Let us say this is the case. If this is the case, we can call P of 131 probability that you have students have a height, students in a class, in your class have a height 131 is 1 by 100. So, this is the example. Just by following this formula, this is what you get. P of 140 is 10 by 100. So, 1 by 100 is 0.001, 10 by 100 is 0.1. So, P of 150 is 15 by 100, which is 0.15. P of 180 is 0, 0 by 100. So, probability P of h is some number between 0 and 1. So, P of h is some number between 0 and 1. So, how does, if you typically plot, you take large number of students in your whole school, in your like or many schools, and take the calculate P of h and plot it, how will it look like? So, it might look like this. So, have a look at this. So, we can call this probability distribution. So, what is this? This is a curve which has a peak somewhere around 150 and this axis it is height and this axis is probability to. So, this is the height h and this is probability of having height h. So, 0 students have the probability of having a height 120 centimeter is nearly 0. There are unlikely that anybody will have such a very small, such a short person. Very high, like above around 190 is also nearly 0. Somewhere in the middle there are many students, like 150 there are many students. So, the probability of finding students having 150 is around 0.05 in this example. So, this is an exercise that you can do. You can calculate the probability distribution the way we defined. So, the probability distribution is probability of having students height h, probability of having students height h is n number of students having height h divided by the total number of students. This will give you the probability. So, now you have this probability. How do you find the average? Can we find the average from these probabilities? So, it turns out that we can. So, let us go back to the definition we had. So, we had discussed probability of having students 131 centimeter, let us say probability of having students 132 centimeter. Similarly, let us say probability of having students 140 centimeter and probability of having students 150 centimeter. So, let us say you have all these probabilities. The average, so basically you have probability of having students having some particular height hi. So, then the average is defined in the following way. The average height is defined as sum over hi p of hi. So, this I goes from 1 to m. So, if you divide this to m intervals, so in our example we had 50. So, 130, 131, 131, 132, 133, 134 up to 180 we had defined. So, 50 heights we had defined. If we define 50 height, m is 50. So, this sum over I 1 to 50 h of I p of hy, this will give you the average. And if I calculate this will give you the square average. So, we have average and square average, h square average and h average. So, this is essentially the same way we had calculated this. So, instead of summing throughout the data set, we can multiply with the probabilities and sum like this. So, then you get average and h square average. So, do this calculation by taking an example in your case. Do an exercise yourself. If you know h average and if you know h square average, we can calculate h square average minus h average square, which is standard deviation. So, the standard deviation that we discussed before can be easily calculated in this particular fashion. So, now we had this h square average and h average square defined in this particular way. So, we had defined h average as sum over I h I p of hi. So, now let us this hi we had 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter before, but let us say we can give hi in a very like 130 centimeter, 130.1 centimeter in a continuous manner. So, if hi is a continuous function, so height, so then if we plot it, let us say it looks like something like this, where every value of h you have a p of hi. For any value of s you take, there is a P of hi. It's as a continuous function. In that case, you can write this sum as an integral. So, just by using the idea of that we learned in this integration, this sum can be written as an integral. So, then in that case the h average can be written as, if h is a continuous function, you can write this as h p of h dh. So, this can be converted to an integral if h is a continuous function. Similarly, if we had h square average, can be written as integral h square p of h dh. So, if h is a continuous function, we can define the averages and square averages in this particular way. In fact, when we did the case of diffusion concentration, we had done precisely this. If you remember, we had defined C tilde, there is something called C tilde of x as C of x by total concentration. So, this is just like we defined today n of h by n, we defined as P of h. This is exactly the same way we had defined concentration. So, this appeared like a probability. So, here this is probability, we said that this is probability. So, this is also like a probability, and we had defined x average and x square average as x C tilde of x dx and x square average as x square C tilde of x dx. So, if you go back to the lecture where we discussed diffusion, we had defined x average and x square average in this particular way. So, the reason for defining this is, as we understand in today's lecture, if you have a distribution. So, C of x or C tilde of x was the probability distribution for concentration. So, the probability of having concentration at a particular distance x. So, what is the probability or the concentration at a particular distance can be defined in some kind of a probability in this particular way, and you can define the averages in this way. Okay. So, now let us go back to the distribution that we had. So, we had a particular distribution in this particular fashion. So, we had a curve which looks like this. So, now what is the name of this curve which is having in this particular kind of a distribution? So, typically most of the things in nature have this bell shaped curve. So, this bell shaped curve or this bell shaped distribution is called normal distribution. So, let us write it. So, the bell shaped curve is called normal distribution. So, many things in nature, as it might be the case with height of students or the mark of students, or there are many examples that we will come along as we go along, we will discuss as we go along. So, in all these examples, the distribution might look like a bell shaped curve. So, then this distribution is called a normal distribution. What is the mathematical property of this normal distribution? How does it look like? So, the shape of this normal distribution can be written mathematically in this particular form. So, look at here, P of h is equal to a exponential some constant b into h minus h average whole square. So, this is the mathematical formula for a normal distribution where a and b are some constants. So, we will clearly understand in the coming classes what does A and B stands for, what is, so there are like some constants. If you wish, in a simpler form we can write it e power minus bx square. So, the simplest we can write it as e power minus bx square if you wish, in a much more simpler manner. So, this has a particular, if this kind of if we have a function of this kind e power minus bx square, so that is called a Gaussian function. So, if you have a function f of x which is e power minus b x square, so this is called a Gaussian. So, the normal distribution also has a name called Gaussian distribution, and which has a bell shaped curve. Now, what is the meaning of this distribution that we will come when we will discuss in the coming lectures, but just realize that there are these examples, in many examples from nature fall into this category. So, let us look some examples from biology. So, some examples from biology include end-to-end distance distribution of long DNA. What does this mean? So, let us say you take a, let us say you look at the DNA. So, let us say DNA has some particular shape and you ask the question, what is the distance of the DNA from one end to the other end? So, this is like a double stranded DNA if you wish, like it will have all this. I am just showing this double stranded DNA as just so let us say very long DNA, and you can ask the question from this end to this end, what is this distance? Let me call this distance as r. So, now let us say that you have, let us say that you have in a petri dish you have a million DNA or Avogadro number of DNA or large amount of DNA. Let us say you have a particular concentration of DNA, and imagine that you have this amazing property that you can just take photograph of each of this DNA. You have, let us say you have this amazing device where you can take the photograph of this DNA. You freeze the DNA at a particular moment and take the photograph. So, if you do that, what do you expect? So, sometimes some DNA will be like this, some DNA will be like this, some DNA will be like this, some DNA will have this shape, some other DNA will have this shape, some other DNA will have this shape. So, here some other DNA might have this kind of a shape. So, now here the distance between the two ends is very small, here the distance between the two ends is very large, here the distance between the two ends is somewhere in between. So, here the distance between the two ends is this, here you have another distance, here the distance is something else, here the distance between the two ends is something else. So, you can, just like we did the experiment of measuring height, you can do an experiment of measuring the end-to-end distance of the DNA, and you can make a histogram and plot it. Then it might look like a Gaussian distribution if you wish. It may look like a Gaussian distribution if you wish. So, it might look something like this, where there can be many of them where the two ends are very close. So, this is r equal to 0 and this is r equal to L, and this is P of r. So, there can be many of the DNA can have this height which is very large, and very small of them having the probability that you will find the DNA which has a very short end to end distance, that means their ends are very close to each other, could be large, and the probability that you will see their ends far apart could be small. If this is the case, this might be look like a normal distribution. So, this is the half of a normal distribution. The other half here, which is the negative part, which is actually meaningless, which we are not plotting. So, this is only one half of the probability distribution of the Gaussian, r greater than 0. If you wish, we can plot this as a vector, but we will not come to that now, but you can get such a distribution. This is one half of a Gaussian distribution. That is, if you plot e power minus a r square between r equals 0 and L, this will look like this. So, if you plot this function e power some constant, we define this as b r square for some value of b between 0 and L, this will look like this. So, this is end to end distribution of a long DNA. So, let's look at the slide here. So, this is the first example, end to end distribution of long DNA. We already saw that concentration of diffusing proteins can have a Gaussian distribution. So, when we discuss the concentration diffusion example, we said that if you have a tube and if you look at a particular time, how many proteins are here, as a distance, if you go from x equal to 0 to either way, there are large number of proteins at the middle of the tube and a fewer proteins at the end of the tube. So, this might have this kind of a Gaussian like a shape. So, if you plot this, this might also have a shape which will be like e power minus some b x square. So, this is another example. You could also think of another example, which is, let us say, amount of a particular gene expressed in cells. So, let us imagine that you can measure the amount of gene expression in cells. So, you have a bunch of cells in a petri dish, and each of the cell you take a particular gene and then see how much of this gene is expressed. So, you can count, let us say, how much mRNA is produced or how much gene expression has happened. So, then what you might get is something like this. So, let's plot here. Let's plot in this axis. So, let's plot something like this, and let's plot some function like this. It should be a little more symmetric. So, when I plotted it was not symmetric. Let us say it looks like a Gaussian. This is not really like a Gaussian, but it should be very symmetric. Okay, Gaussian should be symmetric, but in the case of gene expression, we do not know what should be symmetric or not, but let us say you have such a curve. So, now here in this axis we plot amount of protein expressed, or it could be called this number of mRNA, and amount of protein expressed, and how many cells express this amount. So, number of cells. So, amount, let me call this amount as m, and this is n of m. So, how many cells expressed very little of this gene? Very few cells, number is very small, very few cells, amount very little small amount, large amount is also expressed, like only few number of cells expressed large amount of protein. Maximum number of cells express something intermediate amount of protein. So, if you have this example, this might also look like a normal distribution if you wish, but it will surely have a distribution of this roughly this shape. This is the stem shape which is a peak somewhere in the middle and dying down to the both ends. So, here this is amount of protein expressed versus number of cells having that particular amount of protein. So, we had many examples in biology. So, to summarize, we learned a few things. What all we learned? We learned that probability distribution, you can present the data in the form of distribution, so that it makes much more sense, like a histogram. So, the distribution is one thing we learned, and how do we find averages etc. from the distribution. So, if you know this n of h, the number of students having height, we can define probability distribution P of h as n of h divided by the total number, and we can define averages by sum over I P of h I times h I. We can also define standard deviation in this particular fashion, and there are many examples in biology. So, these are the things that we learned today. We learned about distribution, the height distribution, and how do we convert this distribution to probability distribution, and how do we calculate it, how do we calculate average and standard deviation from this probability distribution, and many examples. So, this is the summary of today's lecture. We will discuss various other distributions and properties of the distributions in the coming lectures, and we will discuss many more biological examples. So, with this we will stop today's lecture with this discussion of distribution or introduction of distributions. We will stop today's lecture, and you should remember this idea of distribution carefully. Think about this carefully, because this is some idea that we will be needing to learn statistics in a better way, and this is very useful to present data and to analyze data. So, just introducing the distribution, we will stop today's lecture. Thank you.